so much. I'm grateful for this whole project, and I want to thank University of Kent and also Gaudi for the invitation to present today and share my work. I think I need to wait. I may have, well, let's hope the sound is fine. If I turn the sound on before, it should be okay. Um, and so, yes, I look forward to our discussion today. This is a mixture of different pieces of work of mine. So I should start by prefacing with what I'm not going to talk about today. And that is really the true fable genre in India, in Indian literature. Animal stories hold a very high place in the Indian tradition in both the medieval Hitopadesha collection and the much earlier and definitely more famous Panchatantra, which is the most extensive in reach and in number of translations. Other works obviously have talking animals in fable form, Buddhist Jatakas. And so I direct you just to a couple of pieces of scholarship by a mentor of mine, Patrick Olivelle, and these each are published in various sources for really excellent work on talking animals in the fable genre for South Asia and early South Asia. So that's what I'm not going to talk about today. Instead, what I will talk about is to outline some other facets of animal language in historical South Asian texts. So first and most extensively, I'll be talking about and providing an overview of the human appraisal of animals' speech capabilities. And this concerns abilities in oral communication that actual animals possessed, as debated by humans over the centuries and written in text. And so now some of this discussion implies a switch from animal language per se, which of course can also include things like gesture, body language, eye contact, mimicry, trickery, and so on, things that have been classified and discussed so well by Alex Parrish in his work. So I'm making a switch from animal language per se to animal speech, right? The actual oral expression by animals involving the organs of speech, the tongue, the teeth, the palate, and other places of articulation in the mouth and the throat. And so my aim in exploring what will be mostly grammatical and philosophical texts and their commentaries is to show that these debates actually illustrate perhaps what we can learn about the South Asian past and what was historically valued about animal speech. And so here in particular, I'm referring to the parrot and parroting, parroting as the ability of some animals to imitate almost flawlessly human speech. And so I'll provide also a shorter counterpoint where I'll reach into another set of texts in order to explore how Indian writers in the past explained the forms that animal speech takes. So how do writers explain, right? Forming etiologies that try to account for how and why animals, non-human animals, communicate the way they do, why animal speech organs take on the forms they actually have in actual reality, if there is such a thing. And so for both points, I've chosen topics from pre-modern India that are deliberately not projects of anthropomorphizing. Rather, they are intellectual and creative attempts at understanding how and why animal speech capacities are the way they are, right? Although, of course, these discussions do end up reasserting human-animal difference, right? And so both of my discussions revolve around historical Indian understandings of how animal speech actually is or was, rather than projecting the sort of anthropomorphizing, projecting onto non-human animals. And these sorts of attempts at explaining animal speech are things we've just seen from Leonie Korneps and others as well. I just read this week or last week in the New Yorker, this write-up on researchers studying bird speech and bird song right now. So this has been a constant for more than 2,000 years, right, of figuring out animal speech. To illustrate these appraisals, I will utilize examples that are used in the very texts that I am discussing, animal examples, right? Animals with very different speech capacities. The parrot, or birds more generally speaking, on the one hand, and the elephant on the other. By parrot, I mean what is technically the Indian parakeet, but is conventionally called the parrot, shuka. This is a very colorful animal with a ring around his or her neck, sometimes quite an assortment of colors, about, say, 14 to 18 inches in length, including the tail. By elephant, I mean the Asian elephant, which goes without any further introduction. The problem that we have and had was a very serious one for ancient Indian thinkers of assessing animal speech. After all, there are animals that appear almost able to produce, they appear to be able to produce the speech of humans, birds, and especially parrots, the parakeet, but I will call him or her parrot throughout. And so this particular concern in ancient India arose given a priority on orality. And so we find traditions in the pre-modern period that relied on textual memorization, on oral reproduction, even when at the same time there was a great deal of writing on paper, on stone, on birch bark, on palm leaf, on all kinds of materials, right? So at the same time as writing on paper, we find a reliance on orality, on sacred texts that had been revealed, right, originally orally to human listeners, right? And where transmission of texts from generation to generation took on the same oral transmission that'll include listening and repeating text exactly as heard, right? And so the precision of memorization is involved as a priority of textual preservation, right? Pause there. Mimicry, in other words, parroting, right, is much more highly valued in a tradition where you need to preserve texts orally because paper is less relevant for these religious texts I'm especially talking about. And the priority is on exact preservation and repetition in exact form, right? Much more than any sort of innovation or modification of a text would be. That would be not highly valued, right? So if one couldn't articulate the whole text aloud perfectly from memory and reproduce orally, one wasn't considered an authority on the text, right? So within this value system, parroting was and still is the ideal. And so, of course, the parrot represents this ideal. So much so that the great Indian sages, some were envisioned to be parrots. In the Tamil tradition, we also have sages that were Paravai birds, but my example today will be from the Hindu epic Mahabharata, where we find the parrot-headed Shuka, whose name literally means parrot, and he was the son of the writer sage Vyasa, who actually wrote the epic Mahabharata, this famous text, right? And so the work of this parrot son is the repetition and transmission of this great, long, huge work, right? You, in fact, need a parrot to convey and transmit this text to future generations. And so we find that since about at least, let's say 500 before the Common Era, the parrot was the ideal repeater of texts. Parroting was of value across Indian religions, and the parrot was an ideal teacher. And this we see especially in Buddhist texts. And so this context, this underlying background can help us understand the discussions that we're exploring today. And so we're going to take up, these were other examples of parrots as narrators teaching text. We're going to take up the question today in a time around the 2nd to the 1st century before the Common Era with a scholar named Patanjali, who was commenting on the much earlier text that was the first text of Sanskrit grammar, Panini's Sutras. And so this gentleman, Patanjali, asked, is animal and particularly bird speech articulate, and how articulate? So this discussion is actually used to establish difference between human and non-human animals, because Sanskrit language rules indicate that we have different verbal forms that you have to use to express verbs if you're talking about animal speech or animal cries. Animals that are speaking together is the phrase, which would be to each other. And we have to use a different verbal form in Sanskrit than we would use to describe human speech of humans speaking together to each other, right? So the grammar doesn't concern us here, but since we have to use different verbal forms, this was a big problem for grammarians and those who were studying Sanskrit grammar seriously, which was a lot of people, let's face it. And so subsequent debates happened over more than a millennium of discussing the extent of difference between animal and human speech. Yeah, because this has to explain why you have to use a different verbal form, regardless of which verb you use to talk about animal cries or animal speech. In debating what was more articulate, the key was vyakta. What constitutes vyakta, articulateness, in human rather than animal voices, right? Patanjali argued things like, well, the bird speech seems to be articulate. And he says, a rooster says cock-a-doodle-doo or cuckoo in Sanskrit, really. And so why does this animal voice require a different verb than many human articulate voices would, right? And so he also uses examples including parrot and myna voice, which both appear to be intelligible, he says. He says we can understand the utterances of such birds. And so commentators like Patanjali were debating what constituted articulate speech and who has it, right? For Patanjali, articulate meant not only manifested and intelligible, but especially articulate in voice. Some kind of special is involved here. This would mean, Patanjali concluded, this has to be a voice that is able to articulate all of the sounds, varnas he calls them, the phonemes you might say, in the Sanskrit alphabet, right? And so this grammarian was gesturing to a perceived lack in animal speech, and he uses as point of comparison one very elite language system of humans, right? The refined Sanskrit language. So in the end, Patanjali concludes that cuckoo or cock-a-doodle-doo is really a human imitation or approximation of what roosters say, and not really what roosters vocalize. So he says it's an upama. This is what humans think or express that roosters are communicating with, which are really different sounds that are manifest, right? If we move ahead over 1,000 years in this, what was a written debate, we find another grammar commentator, Kayatra, of the 11th century, and he continues the discussion. And he writes that parrots, mynas, and other birds do not innately, swabhavikam, have an articulate voice. What's this? He writes that the range of some of their sounds in parrots, mynas, and so on, is because of the will, vasha, and effort of humans, right? Meaning that humans must be present for parrots to articulate articulately. Of course, he was rather astute in observing that it's only caged birds, birds in captivity, or at least in regular contact with humans, who adopt these speech patterns of human language. This is something that Western biologists only came to record and note in the 20th century. Regardless, moving forward in time, closer to our modern era, with Nagesha, we see an observable shift toward a different ideology, perhaps, of greater human exceptionalism, so that by the 17th and 18th centuries, this Sanskrit language commentator, Nagesha, claims that animals lack an articulate voice that's like that of humans, and that's why you have to use a different verbal form, right? This whole debate on animal voice ends up reasserting human-animal difference, increasingly so over the centuries. But these experts in language did not commit anthropodenial of the sort that Frans de Waal is famous or well known for discussing, right? These scholars did not underestimate commonalities between human speech and other animal speech, right? Patanjali himself problematized human notions about what constitutes language and speech and what we think about animal voice. So even though for him human language and human speech was special and privileged, he defined human speech in the context of other forms of speech, right? He's accounting for more. My next example of the historical appraisal of animal speech comes not from the grammar tradition, but from philosophy, a totally different intellectual debate, where we find philosophers questioning things like, can parrots be teachers of texts to others? Can we learn knowledge from parrots? What is remarkable in these intellectual debates is that philosophers, so he was engaging and responding to some other thinkers, philosophers, especially around this medieval period, took animal language and cognitive capacities very seriously and found it worth discussing and recording in their writing. I'm thinking in particular of this Gangesha, a new logician of the 14th century, although there were preceding schools of philosophy, and not even within his own school, that more or less were in agreement on most of the points of his argument. So for Gangesha, parrots did have knowledge of words and of the sequence of words, and were able to construct sentences that can lead a listener to valid cognitions. So for this philosopher, parrots' knowledge of words allowed them to form words in sentences or sequences, yeah? And upon being heard by a human listener, this could result in a human acquiring knowledge or some new understanding, or the human could listen and realize that the utterance contained a fallacy and say, no, 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 that's not right. And so a parrot's utterances can, quote, or can persuade humans of the relation of the bird's statements to reality, to factual reality. That was a concern for these philosophers, right? Now, these these philosophers were not saying that parrots always necessarily knew exactly what they were saying in all circumstances, right? This would be more akin to a situation of, let's say, a gifted child who is reading aloud from a book on quantum physics, and you could listen and may in fact learn quite a lot from this child's recitation from the book. But there could also be parts that the child, him or herself, didn't comprehend while reading, right? So we're not assuming full understanding in a semantic sense, perhaps all the time at least, right? Nonetheless, the bird constructs meaningful sentences from word knowledge alone, Gangesha said. And what's more, bird utterances can be authoritative and can result in knowledge. That is, can result in you learning due to the parrot's statements conforming to an original past utterance. This is the parroting thing, right? It's due to the parrot's impeccable ability to mimic another person's voice that they can be teachers or provide testimony. And this could even be in a court of law. Yeah, we've got all kinds of, from the story tradition as well, stories of parrots giving away what's really been happening, for example, among lovers, so on. Really, this discussion of Gangesha is an epistemological question of the means or sources of knowledge, pramana, that can act as authority or authoritative, right? How we learn, how we come to know things. Sources or valid means of attaining knowledge in most epistemological systems of South Asia include things like you have direct or firsthand experience. For example, you feel heat, you know there's fire, you're going to burn yourself, right? That's learning something. You also have inference where you can smell or see the smoke, and that's how you come to understand there's fire, right? All sorts of other common sources of knowledge. Not all are agreed upon in all the schools of philosophy, but that's fine. The one of concern to us today that gives us pause is verbal testimony. Yeah. Testimony is how a professor, for example, passes on knowledge to students in a classroom in the conventional sense, speaking in a lecture, as I am now, and also how, let's say, the author of a written book would transmit knowledge. It would be verbal testimony. We accept, or we don't accept, the author's testimony to be true and veridical. Yeah? It's still testimony, right? So far, we have found that parrots and chickens can almost perfectly, but not quite, produce the articulations of the Sanskrit language, but can, without a doubt, serve, and this is according to these philosophers, serve as teachers or as witnesses, providing testimony in a court of law in early India, speaking utterances that result in new knowledge or new understanding among human listeners. So what then of the elephant, my counterpoint for today? It may surprise many to learn, or maybe it doesn't surprise you at all, that the elephant is acknowledged in many Indian texts from the earlier period, pre-modern period, to have the capacity to work in multiple languages, to comprehend many human languages when captive elephants are trained, I am referring to. I'm sharing a couple of these examples here for you now. And here I'm segueing from what were more philosophical or grammatical texts into the realm of, from now on in, the epic. Epics are sometimes considered legendary, right? But Hindu epics, such as the Mahabharata, and I'm going to give an example or two from this work, form part of a group of literature that's called itihasa. This literally means how things were. It was like this, right? In modern languages of North India, itihasa is the word for history, right? And so this is how things were in the past, right? It was like this in the past. So with this, I'm going to share with you one history, it's an etiology, of how elephants lost the ability to speak and became inarticulate. And this means, of course, there was a prior, earlier historical moment, and not just assumed, but we have described in text as well, when elephants could speak and in fact could sing. I've put a little passage here from an elephant song. And Goldman has a short text on this if you'd like to read an article on elephant song. The etiology that I'll be talking about explains why elephants now cannot speak. And I'm showing you this image on purpose so you can see the points of articulation and the speech organs of the elephant, or at least part of them, not the ones deep in the neck. And so this etiology explains why the elephant can't speak articulately now and why elephant tongues point backwards. They're not able to bring their tongues to the front of their mouth or outside protruding at all. Why would they need to? They have a trunk, and that's fabulous, right? So here is sort of a summary of the story. The gods wanted the god of fire, Agni, to fight one demon named Tartaka, and Agni didn't want to fight, and so he runs away instead, and he's trying to hide from all of the other gods. And one elephant in the forest sees him and gives him away. He reveals Agni's location to all the other gods. This pleases the gods, but Agni is furious and upset. Why did you give me away? Why did you tattle on me? And so Agni curses all two-tuskers, all elephants, saying, your tongues will go backwards. You've got a lot of curses and boons in the epics of India. But the gods, of course, were very happy and very pleased that this elephant had told the truth, yeah, and had said where Agni was and said, no, 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 even with your tongues going backwards, you can't reverse the curse of someone else. But even with this, tongues unable to move out of the mouth, you will still be able to eat all kinds of food. You'll be able to voice out, and the word is vacham, which is the word for words or speech. You'll be able to voice out words or speech whose syllables are inarticulate, again, we find. And so this is sort of compromise and explains why elephants have the tusk, right? Because their tongues don't have this capacity for moving food in the mouth and so on. And so we have this really quite amusing and interesting story accounting for, it's an etiology to explain why elephant tongues go backwards. And the elephant's mouth is a very, very strange thing. In cases of captivity, of course, elephants in captivity feed themselves too with their trunks, but where you have humans feeding, you can see here quite readily that the human has to put the hand quite deeply in the mouth if the elephant is not expected to use the trunk. And really, because the elephant will be unable to move the food using the tongue, him or herself. Here's yours truly, I'm feeding an elephant, and wow, that's as far, you can see most of my arm, but the tongue is not, I don't have a pointer now, the tongue is not any farther toward the front or the chin, right? I have to have this far in to be able to get the food to reach to be able to be swallowed, right? But of course, the elephant in real life uses the trunk, so this is not real life. In normal, non-captive existence, and eating on his or her own, the elephant just feeds herself, right? And so this is not an issue, but we have this textual explanation of what is a different system of points of articulation, right? Of points of contact of the tongue and other surfaces of the mouth that are instrumental in Sanskrit and are much discussed in the language tradition as shiksha, articulation and pronunciation in Sanskrit. And so this is something that's discussed not only for humans, but for other animals too, we find. So what does this all mean? What can we learn from understanding how elephants lost the ability to speak articulately, or that parrots can actually be teachers and treated as teachers, and used as sources of knowledge and testimony, witnesses? What do we learn of the debate on exactly how a chicken's voice is or is not articulate? Ancient and medieval Indian writers were willing to grant animals some of the same speech capacities as humans. The elephant, on the other hand, had very different speech production abilities. And this also has to be explained, or had to be explained. How could elephants come to have such strange tongues and throats, right? Finally, Indian thinkers were willing to take parrots on as potentially valid sources for acquiring new knowledge. The parrot, in fact, can be your teacher. Overall, we find ancient and medieval writers putting non-human animals on a spectrum, perhaps, of speech production, on the same spectrum as humans. And so this is one of degree and not kind, to go back to Darwin's phrase. These are not opposing binaries where humans possess reason and some special specialness that non-human animals don't have, right? We don't have this situation where animals are wholly unlike humans. But it is precisely on this point of a voice's articulateness that we find the criterion for distinguishing between human and animal. And animals were never regarded as speechless or languageless, as we do find in Western sources, especially from the philosophical tradition, as Ka already mentioned. But for pre-modern India, animals were generally considered limited in voice capacity, right? But of course, you don't have to take my human word for it. So thank you so much for today. I look forward to our discussion.